Current Reach Firefighters, working with the Department of Defense, the Missoula Technology and Development Center, and the U.S. Forest Service. Dr. Ruby's extracurricular interests include sculpture, fly fishing, hiking, leading an anti-sloth lifestyle, and camping with his family. So I hope you're just as excited as I am in that. So please welcome me and join me in welcoming Dr. Brent Ruby for this exciting webinar. Take it away, Brent.
Thanks so much. Let me click over to this first slide. Yeah, so this is the first time I've done something like this. It's surprising, but I really think that this is a neat format, and it helps me do what I'm becoming more and more passionate about, and that is trying to get the peer-reviewed research that we've done into the hands of the crews and the different teams that we have worked with. And it's certainly not just fire. We've done a lot of work with these groups. Let me remember how to do the pointer. We've done these groups, lots of studies with these funding agencies from the Air Force through DARPA, U.S. Special Operations Command, the Army, and the Office of Naval Research. So what I'm going to try to do for you today is give you 20 years worth of research in a shortened version. So as we go through this, if you have questions, like Amanda said, you can put them in the chat box, and then we'll get to those afterwards. But our center at the University of Montana, we have a center that has an environmental chamber facility. That's this system here. That allows us to mimic pretty much any environment on the planet, which is helpful in a lab condition because we can set it, we can control everything, and do some of the studies that we're interested in the heat, in the cold, at different altitudes. That just is a great asset to our in-lab environment. We also have two of these trailers. This is an old 1964 Airstream that we gutted and rebuilt. And then this is a fairly new one. These allow us to go out into the field and collect all the samples that we might be playing around with depending on the setting or the study. And we're passionate about being able to collect as much data and do research in the field as often as we do it basically in the lab. And usually we do that annually. So when you look at the different studies that we have done in the field, of course, a lot of work done in the world of fire. I'll share with you about 20 years worth of stuff that we've been working on. We've done lots of stuff with endurance athletes. We did a big overtraining study where we took cyclists from Missoula to Colorado and back a little over 2,000 miles in 21 days to look at markers of overtraining and whatnot. These are samples we were collecting at the Badwater Ultramarathon in Death Valley. This is on top of Mount Evans in Colorado, which is just over 14,000 feet.
Hey, Brent, sorry to cut in. Just if you use the highlighter or the pointer, then people can see where you're pointing.
Oh, is it? Let me use the highlight. I've got this. Can you guys see this pointer?
If you have to remember it's the footprint. If you step it down, then we should be able to see it.
Like that.
Uh-oh, I'm not seeing it.
Oh, there it is.
Oh, there we go. There it is.
Okay, gotcha. Sorry. I'm just moving it around with my mouse. So, but these are where the pointer is. That's the Air Force Special Operations Command. This is Mount Evans in Colorado, Mount Rainier in Washington. You guys know what this is all about. And then this was a big cycling study we did, an overtraining marking study. This is in Badwater during the Ultramarathon in Death Valley. And then this is at Ironman in Hawaii. That gives us a wide range of environments and settings where we can chase people through and collect all sorts of samples, from urine samples to blood samples, saliva samples to hair samples to even skeletal muscle biopsy samples. So in the world of wildland fire, I didn't know I was going to get into this 20 years ago or so, but a colleague, Brian Sharkey, who some of you may know that name, he was the one that developed the STEP test years and years ago to try to put some work for hire physical standards in place. He followed that up with the PAC test, which we'll talk a little bit about today as well. So I've been doing this a long time, and it's been just an absolute research joy of mine to work with the different teams over the last several years. These are some of the papers. These are a lot of the papers that we've done in the world of fire, and we have a very solid foundation within the peer-reviewed literature. There are teams in Australia, there are teams in Canada that have also done wildland physiology or wildland fire physiology, but we've done more than most all of those teams, and every single one of these papers, unlike some of the others, all the others in the literature, these are all collected on actual assignments. So we're not simulating anything. We're not lighting a prescribed research fire to study people. These are actual incidents. And that is somewhat of a difference between our field methodologies and what other teams have brought to the table. Comprehensively, though, it gives us a really solid understanding of what the job is all about, and it provides, by doing the peer-reviewed literature, or by going through the process and getting it into the research literature, it provides a foundation to build off of. That could be anything from policy to practices that are defensible. And that's very important to us, rather than just, oh yeah, we've collected this data. When we collect the data in the world of fire, it gets into the literature. If you're interested in any of these papers, you can certainly email me and I can send you that PDF of that original manuscript. It's super exciting reading, I can tell you that. My son, ages ago, has tried to convince me that I need to make more apps because he's convinced that not very many people are reading my papers. So there may be an app coming to a platform near you at some point down the line, but that is something that we're playing around with. So the other area that is an area that we've done a lot of research is in this unique ultra endurance world, and this has carryover into the world of fire because it's really the ultimate ultra occupational sort of environment, and we've done lots of studies with high-level athletes in the mountains, on bikes, looking at overtraining, changing their fed state, fasted state. We've even studied sled dogs and their drivers during the Iditarod. So a wide range of different things. But all this kind of adds to what the big numbers that humans can do, which is pretty impressive. What I'm going to do today is to give you an impression of the demands of the job from the research that we've done, some historic and present day fitness demands that are in the literature, and provide a foundation for why there are standards within the agencies in terms of what kind of fitness level you need to bring to the job starting on day one, maybe even before that. I'll talk some on how to manage heat stress, because heat-related injuries, those are always going to be looming in the background because the environment that you're working in can be hot. I mean, fire's hot, and it creates a hot ambient environment, or it goes alongside of a hot ambient environment. When you couple that with the work rate of the muscle, the body produces an enormous amount of heat, and you have to get rid of that heat. If you don't get rid of that heat and you store it, your core body temperature goes up, and it puts you in harm's way for heat-related issues. What I will do is provide some background and some counterpoint to the idea that heat stress and practicing solid hydration or becoming obsessed with ensuring adequate hydration, those two things need to be separated, and I'll try to draw a line between those two. They do not go hand in hand. Then I'll spend some time talking to you about eating on the line and some shift fuel and how that has implications for safety, especially late in the day. We started 20 years ago with a grant that I got from the U.S. Army Medical Research and Material Command. The focus of that study series was to look at sex differences in metabolism and also total energy expenditure during a military-like activity. And it's very difficult to study military individuals in training, in combat. And so here we are in Montana, and I thought, wow, what if we studied wildland firefighters as a surrogate population to the warfighter? We can gain access to these guys, men and women, I think, and it could provide a very real world backdrop to understanding how humans behave in these different environments and what are the limitations both from a hydration standpoint, a heat stress management standpoint, and how do we feed these people. So that's what we started doing 20-some years ago. And from day one, the community has been nothing but just absolutely awesome at helping us collect some of these samples. It's not all that easy to deliver these stable isotopes orally in fire camps and ensure an adequate place to get the nude body weights that we need to get regularly. We need to get urine samples at predictable times. We need to have access to these teams. And sometimes they don't come back into fire camp. So when that happens, we have to go to them to get their body weights, to get the samples, and so on. But we started with these two studies looking at the overall energy demands of the job. We wanted to set the stage and figure out just what does this job cost. Once we had that in place, then we could build off of that in terms of manipulating some diet, looking at fitness, looking at a whole host of other things. The techniques that we used for this are the gold standard techniques for measuring energy expenditure in free-range humans and free-range animals. So this is an exceptionally detailed, high-resolution technique that allows us to calculate the total energy expenditure over multiple days on the job. So these values that you'll see here, these are 24-hour values where you can see about 4,000 or so kcals per day for energy expenditure with a fairly wide range. As you can imagine, the assignments dictate how hard you work, where you work on these fires, and where the geography is that you have to combat and tackle. It's very different in Idaho and Montana, where it's super steep and high mountains and whatnot, compared to other locations like Florida, where it's a lot hotter, but it's a flat piece of ground. So what we did originally with this study, this is the original study we did back in the late 90s, and we see about a 4,000 kcal per day energy expenditure on average, with a very large range, the highest value being up above 6,000 calories per day. That is a 5-day average for energy expenditure. So that's the one thing that this technique cannot do. It can't give us day-to-day values. We have some tighter resolution for certain studies, but in this group, we're only interested in what does it cost over a 5-day window, recognizing you could have a 4,000 calorie day and then the next day could be 7. This technique can't distinguish between those. It only gives us an average per 24 hours for the whole measurement period. But 15 years later, we saw the same kind of results that we saw originally in the late 90s. And that just suggests not only is the job hard, but it has remained hard, and it probably will still remain hard unless we start to deploy robots in the field with you to help alleviate some of the stress. But it's going to be a hard-working job, and it's one of the few hard-working occupational tasks that is still present in our highly mechanized world. So that sets the stage for how hard the job is. When you break it down into average energy expenditure or average hourly energy expenditure. Now, the reason why I've chosen these kind of numbers like this, where you see 16 or in this case 13 mLs per kilogram per minute, those are estimated values of oxygen consumption. And the reason for translating this data into those numbers is so that you can have a comparison with what the oxygen consumption is typically, what oxygen consumption is typically required to complete the U.S. Forest Pack test. So the oxygen consumption of the pack test, if you walk that in 45 minutes, which is 4 miles an hour, the oxygen consumption averages about 22.5 mLs per kilogram minute, okay? So I'll come back to that a little bit later, but that gives you an idea of how hard the pack test is relative to how hard the job is in terms of an overall average. Now, what this doesn't do is it does not pinpoint high points and low points during the day, and I'll talk a little bit about that too. Let me turn this off. Okay. So when you look at some of the early stuff that Brian did with measuring oxygen consumption with a system like this, so this is a large bag and a mouthpiece and something to hold the mouthpiece in place, and you just collect expired gas from the participant doing whatever they're doing. Maybe they're doing these kind of tasks, which are common fire tasks on the line, or we did this study on the river right outside the university to look at what stand-up paddleboard activity looks like. It's a very simple technique. It's a very accurate technique, but it only allows you to collect small amounts of gas. This is about a 2-minute collection of gas. That's how big that thing gets. That's how much air you're expiring in about 2 minutes time. So when you look at the energy costs or the kcals per minute for most fire activity, Brian, this is collected back in the 60s and 70s. Brian showed these numbers. Now, the biggest variability within the energy expenditure of a typical day comes from this type of activity, which is hiking, because you could be standing still, you could be hiking on flat ground with a load, you could be hiking uphill with a load. Depending on terrain and speed, that has a large influence on what the overall energy expenditure is of the job. So the higher the load carriage and the faster the speed, that elevates the energy expenditure quite a bit compared to very slow walking without a pack, okay? So when you look at all of these tasks here, all of these come out to an oxygen consumption that is in the range of about 16 to 42. That's a huge range. And the reason for that range is when you're carrying a load and you're walking fast, it's considerably harder than just walking slow downhill without a load, okay? That's important to know. The biggest variability in the metabolic challenges on the line do not come from these tasks. They come from changing the pace of the load carriage. So all of these calculations down here, from shoveling and whatever else, we can put those into the same common units of measure that the pack test requires. Keep in mind that the pack test is around 22, 23 mLs per kg. That's the history of that. So if we go, let me skip to the next deck here. So with Brian's work, he concluded that most of the tasks on the fire line, that's on the fire line, digging line, hiking on the line, most of those tasks came out to be about 7.5 kcals per minute, which is what the pack test mirrors. So most fireline tasks result in an overall oxygen consumption of 22.5 mLs per kg, which is identical. So most of the things on the line match up with the aerobic demands that the PAC test is designed to do. Now, there's a whole host of arguments that can say, well, the PAC test is not an ideal test. There's no such thing as a perfect test. The beauty of the PAC test is it allows us to test, or allows you guys to test a fairly large group of people in a short amount of time. There's all kinds of arguments across the world that suggest, should we be doing something more difficult? Is it too hard? When you look at the research, it definitely is justifiable as a work standard because it matches up with most of the tasks that are completed on the line. Are there things that are done that are harder than the PAC test? Absolutely. Crews are always asked to do things that are sometimes harder than the PAC test, but those are very difficult to identify using some of these techniques. It's not like we can take those bags and collect gas samples with crews on the actual fire line or walking to the fire line. That's a little bit more cumbersome and difficult to do. And I'll share with you some new data that the folks at NTDC and us have worked on that shed some new light on that. So Brian designed the STEP test years and years ago, and the reason for the data that was collected from that STEP test, it was to estimate a maximal oxygen consumption that was equivalent to about 45 mLs per kilogram minute. The reason for the 45 is most of the tasks that are completed on the fire line are approximately 50% of this value. And so it's generally thought in the world of exercise physiology that you can sustain a work rate for long periods of time at or around 50% of your max. And so if most of the fire line tasks require this level of oxygen consumption, it would be great if your maximal capacity was at least this. And so that's the history behind the STEP test. However, there were ways to cheat the STEP test, and it wasn't necessarily fire specific. It only did an adequate job of predicting this number. It didn't mirror this kind of activity, load carriage, on the line, getting to the line, whatever. And so it's a much more specific test, but that is designed to require candidates to sustain an oxygen consumption that is comparable to what has been measured, what was measured by Brian and also measured by Australians on the line in research fires that they set, more of a controlled burn scenario. So that's sort of the history behind the PAC test. It is a solid test for mimicking the metabolic costs of most tasks on the line. Bud and his group in Australia, what they did is they also collected data on research fires that they set and had people put out and work on. And that is a little bit different, to a lot different than an actual assignment, because they're researchers working with the forest to create this simulated wildfire assignment that might, I mean, humans are interesting. When you say you're going to measure something from them or you tell them that they're in a study, sometimes that changes their behavior. That classic Hawthorne effect, when somebody is observing you, your behavior shifts a little bit. You may actually work a little bit harder to try and impress whoever is collecting the data. I haven't seen too much of that in the world of fire, but we certainly see that in the lab periodically. It depends on, it's especially true if we've got a young male working hard in the heat chamber and we got a nice, pretty grad student or undergrad student that's recording his heart rate and the perception of how hard he feels like he's working. He's working his ass off, but he doesn't want to admit it to the research assistant. So what this group in Australia discovered by collecting bags of gas like Brian did, like those pictures I showed you, they concluded also that the average work rates of all fireline tasks are equivalent to essentially what the PAC test is. So we've got groups in the U.S., we've got groups in Australia that are backing up this. Now, the groups in Canada, the group in Canada has gone a different direction, and they have hand-selected what are essentially the hardest things that are done on the line. Now, none of this data here was collected and developed during real assignments. This was collected and developed during simulations in Canada. But the thing that's very different is that the average energy expenditure of these tasks here are considerably higher than what people in the U.S., our team in the U.S., and the group in Australia have observed on real fires. So they have gone a different direction by requiring a very aggressive work capacity test that averages, in some studies that they've done with that, they show an average heart rate of about 178 beats per minute, which is considerably higher than almost all activity done on the fire line, which is what we've done. We've collected heart rate on the line, and we see various ranges, but rarely are they this high. So those are the different discrepancies within the field. When you look at some new data that we're working on right now with MTDC, what they did with this is, and we've helped them try to dial in these tables have shifted a little bit since I submitted this information for the webinar, but we're working on this paper right now. Basically what we did, or what they did, was they put GPS systems on teams, on type 1 and type 2 crews and on engine crews during the assignment. So that is ingress hiking to the fire line, hiking around the fire line, and hiking out from the fire line in comparison to training hikes. And so we've got a pretty good sample size here of over 130 people. The tricky part with this kind of data collection, because it's pretty equipment heavy, they were only studying like 3 people a day. So it took a long time to collect all this data on real fire. And this is a missing link within the literature. We've done the measures of total energy expenditure. This allows us to look at load carriage and hiking, which is, like I showed you before, the hardest parts likely of the job in terms of the metabolic demand. And so what they're seeing is that for, depending on the crew, like these hotshot crews, this is an estimated oxygen consumption. Here's the estimated oxygen consumption for type 2 crews and for engine crews. And what you see is these numbers don't vary that much from what the PAC test requires. There may be some evidence that some crews work at a higher than PAC test work rate during certain access points. These numbers are a little bit inflated compared to the actual numbers presently. And I can glance at those, but they're in the mid to high 20s. So it's a little bit harder than the PAC test here and there, but on average, it comes out pretty darn close. In contrast, what they do during training exercises is considerably harder than what they tend to do on the line, at least with this data set. So this is going to fill a gap, and it provides some more substantial data and adds to the literature from what we've done so far on actual fire assignments. So it basically suggests that the PAC test does a pretty darn good job. It has its limitations, but it does an adequate job for most tasks. There may be some evidence that certain crews during small times during certain assignments might work at a higher work rate, but those are, I don't want to say few and far between. Those do not represent the majority of the overall work, I guess. So here's the here's some of the stuff that we're hoping to do with the program that we're developing. What if we could take the PAC test, and I always like to say, what if we could make the PAC test great again? What if we could take the PAC test and instead of just providing you, the user, with good job, you passed, you're in, what if we could do something more? I think that we can do a pretty solid diagnostic calculation using the PAC test, using the finish time, coupled with input descriptives like height, wage, sex of the individual, and age. If we know the finish time and the heart rate at the end of the PAC test, we can do a diagnostic calculation and we can estimate what that individual's sustainable oxygen consumption looks like. So that means if you finish the PAC test and you're on a hotshot crew and you finish the PAC test in, who cares? It's 44:30. It doesn't matter. It's not like it's a performance. It's not designed to be a 1.5 mile run. It's just, did you do it under 45 minutes? Good, you passed. But if we knew your heart rate at the end of that, if your heart rate at the end of that was, say, 115 beats per minute, that seems very different in terms of what that person is bringing to the table compared to somebody that finishes right alongside that guy, that hotshot, at 44:30, but this person's heart rate is 160, yet they both pass. But if you take those data and build a diagnostic calculation, it could really strengthen some training or tighten up some of the training recommendations. So we're trying to develop that right now. The trickiest part to this is not getting any of these other things. It's not getting finish time. It's not making sure that the packs are 45 pounds. The hardest part is getting an accurate heart rate at the end of that thing. And you can do that a couple of ways. Obviously, the best way is to use a heart rate monitor. And the only heart rate monitors at present that will do this adequately are the chest strap heart rate monitors, like the Polar and other companies that use a chest strap. I know that you might be thinking, hey, wait a minute, there's a Fitbit system, there's this system that might be able to take it on the wrist. We can talk about that if you want to, but wrist calculations are not nearly as reliable as a chest strap monitor. It needs to be EKG quality, and a chest strap monitor does that better than anything else. This is something that we're presently trying to develop. I've got some pretty solid calculations built so that at some point down the line we may be introducing simple assessments that you can use, like, hey, for today's PT, why don't you warm up by carrying a 45-pound pack and just walk a mile? Or if you're not required to carry 45-pound pack, carry 25-pound pack, whatever. But warm up for a mile and give us your heart rate and your finish time and your age. We can estimate the oxygen consumption of that, link that to the heart rate and your age, and get some really solid numbers that can help you towards progression or readiness. So that's something I'm really hoping we can work on here in the near future. Okay, the next step I'll talk to you a little bit about. Some of these got a little bit funky, these slides here, but it looks like the wording is a little bit different. But nonetheless, you get the picture. This has to do with some of the work that we've done in the area of heat-related injury risk. Most of the time when people think about heat-related injury, they think about the weather and they think about hydration. And the problem is the primary heat load that the individual develops is a function of their own metabolic activity. So the harder they work with let's see, let me switch this, with the gear that they're wearing. If they're wearing a lot of gear, like a pack, like clothing that restricts offloading of heat, they're going to retain that heat. And if they work too hard, this increases core temperature. It's not the most popular measure. We can't really do these measures on the fire line. I don't think we'd have any volunteers, but we do this all the time in the lab. It's the best way to measure core temperature. You may have heard of ingestible sensors that you can do. Those don't work that well, and they're not as good. So if you have in combination a measure of heart rate and rectal temperature, which is easily done in the lab, you can get a marker of heat stress, which is called the physiological strain index. Well, because heart rate's pretty easy to measure, rectal temperature is not easy to measure in the field, and so we've tried to develop another system that we're trying to work on that uses chest skin temperature and heart rate. So if we put those two things together, we can get an estimate of your heat signature score. There's lots of names we've used for that. But if I were to put these on if I were to put this on a crew of 20 hotshots and they started hiking into the fire line, within the first 5 minutes of that task, I could tell you who was going to be at the highest risk for heat-related injury based on that initial 5-minute data set. And that's without measuring anything related to internal body temperature. So what we've done over the years is we've built these different monitoring systems, we've built these different predictive algorithms to assist different teams in managing heat stress. Now, the background in the Marine Corps, they use very successfully weather monitoring to limit the activities that they can do. It mandates what sort of work-rest ratios they have to work with, and it also directs them to what their hydration expectations might need to be. The problem is it doesn't speak at all to the fitness level or lack of fitness of the individual. And so when you look at the historical medical research within the Department of Defense, more heat injuries happen to younger individuals than experienced individuals, and more heat injuries happen during combat-specific occupations. So what that tells the world of fire, I think, is that you've got to watch your young trainees that are less experienced, because they also think they have something to prove, and they can get themselves in trouble by working too hard in that environment. So it's also important that you ensure that your frontline crews, that is the initial attack and some of these hotshot crews, that they focus on reasonable work-rest ratios. So it's not just go, go, go. There's got to be a stop and go to the process. That will help alleviate heat production, and it'll help facilitate offloading of heat, okay? So when you look at hydration on the fire line, what's interesting is this is a 5-day study. So this data was collected over 5 days. Their body weight went from 72 kilograms to 71 kilograms. Their total body water, which is a measure that we can do with some of these tracers, went from about 43 liters to 42 liters. So in 5 days of work, at an energy expenditure of about 5,000 calories per day, the water budget was 35 liters. So in order for them to be perfectly hydrated, they'd have to drink 7 liters a day for 5 days. Well, these guys are not weighing themselves consistently. They don't have scales out on the line. But after 5 days, they only came up 1 liter shy of balance. So dehydration on the fire line, not a big deal. And we've done this over and over in different studies. This is a follow-up. This is the daily water turnover. In our latter study, it was a little bit higher at about 9.5 liters per day. But same thing, after 3 days at about 5,000 calories per day, 9.5 liters in 3 days, they only lost 0.3 kilograms. So again, hydration is not a big deal, at least with these very experienced crews. Now, there's going to be fluctuations during the day, but overall they do a pretty darn good job. And it's not just 1 or 2 studies we've done. We've collected over 220 work days to develop these numbers. and the average comes out to be 7.5 liters every day in terms of a hydration demand. Here's the range from all 4 of these. Whoa, get that guy. All 4 of these different studies, okay? So hydration is important, but they seem to answer the call pretty effectively. In comparison to some of the other crazy events that we've studied, like at Ironman, Ironman is about 12 liters in 12 hours. That's the amount of water that's lost and put back. The Western States 100, which is a 100-mile trail race in Northern California, that is about 27 hours, and that requires about 18 liters over that 27-hour window. The worst possible environment on the planet for ultra athletes is Badwater, which is in Death Valley. Over 45 minutes, they lose, over 45 hours, they lose and put back 35 liters of fluid. Now, there's no possible safe way to do this without the use of electrolytes and foods that also bring electrolytes. You can't just do this with water alone. It would kill you. And these amounts are, even like at Ironman, I mean, that is an enormous amount in 12 hours. Never once have we studied firefighters and seen values that high. It's not warranted because the work rate is not as hard as what these athletes are doing on these hot lava fields in Kona. So that's just a comparison of some very different, ugly, high-intensity, long-duration stuff that humans can pull off. The mechanisms that lead to heat-related injuries, we did this study. This was part of an electrolyte study where we were providing electrolytes in these electronic Camelback systems. Those systems allowed us to quantify fluid intake over the course of a day. And what we noticed was, well, one of our subjects, not because of the methodology, but just he worked himself too hard, he ended up with heat exhaustion. But we monitored all of his data along the line, which is kind of interesting. But when you look at some of the deaths, like this semi-recent death in Texas that occurred, it's not because of hydration. It's because of hyperthermia, which is an elevated body temperature that's created by the individual by simply working their body temperature up to dangerous levels. There's no way you can drink yourself out of hyperthermia if your work rate is off the charts. You cannot drink enough to do that. It's completely disconnected. So in the person that went down that we captured data from, he was fine. He was taken to the hospital, but it created a shitstorm because they had to cut a landing pad for the helicopter, fly in a helicopter, fly him out, get him to an ambulance on the ground, get him to the hospital. It created a nightmare for the crews and the individuals involved. We collected all of his body temperature. This is his body temperature going up and eventually reaching a point that created heat exhaustion and his collapse. They did a really good job of cooling him off so they could bring that temperature down. But look at his drink pattern. These are drink pattern values here, these black lines. You can see the drink, the hourly fluid intake. And when the temperature started to get warm, when his core temperature started to get warm, what did he do? He started to dramatically increase his hourly drink volume. In this 2 hours, he drank almost 2.5 liters when the ambient conditions were exceedingly high. Now, another measure that we use is activity monitors. These are not like a Fitbit. They're worn in the pocket of these guys, of the shirts, and these provide us with movement patterns in XYZ directions. And the typical range that we see falls in this area. The guy that overheated himself was above that for most of the day, leading up to his eventual collapse. So he's digging line very, very aggressively, high heart rate, And because of that, his body temperature just soared, and that created his collapse. He was doing what he has been told to do, what most firefighters are told to do, and that is the morning safety message is not short on, I mean, you might as well just record it. It's the same thing. I've heard it over and over every morning. It's going to be hot out there, guys. Make sure to drink, drink, drink. That is the most common hydration message I've heard. And the problem with that is you cannot drink yourself to safety if you're working at these high intensities. It's much more important to focus on work to rest ratios and enabling an offloading of heat than it is to say fight fire aggressively without paying attention to your heat production. You can't offload heat fast enough. And so there is this an interesting disconnect between what most people think hydration is there for, which is to maintain total body water and blood volume. That is important, but if you're working too hard, you're still going to overheat. Most of the people that die on the football fields are not dying. None of them are dying because of dehydration. They're dying because of an excessive increase in body temperature, and that's brought about by the exercise and the activity of the muscles. So when you look at the patterns of these core temperatures, these are systems that we've used to measure core temperature in the field with these little ingestible transmitters. Most of the time they spend at these lower temperatures. Very rarely do they get themselves up into these high ranges because they know if they do, it could be all over. And so they're very smart at regulating. We've done studies where we've taken people that are less aerobically fit and more aerobically fit, put them in the heat chamber, and identified their risk based on their core body temperature and their heart rate. Those people that ran slower than 24 minutes for a 3-mile event, most of them, when we put them at a work intensity comparable to the pack test for 90 minutes, all those slower individuals had issues with heat stress. We didn't take anybody to heat exhaustion, but they all started to show signs and symptoms, at least based on their measurements, that they were starting to overheat. In contrast, the people that had a higher aerobic fitness, none of them were at risk. So the aerobic fitness that you bring to the job on day one has a big influence of how you're going to tolerate the heat. The last thing I'll talk to you a little bit about is eating strategies. We've manipulated the diets of these guys, and we've changed their work outputs. We've tricked them into working harder and feeling the same. And the bottom line is increasing the number of eating episodes during the day. The more pockets of food that you can consume in small amounts, the better off you are. One thing we're trying to do, and maybe work with the catering contract, is to figure out a simple strategy on how to make that giant sandwich more accessible. If you can consume an item of food every 40 or every 60 to 75 minutes, with the goals being about 25 to 40 grams of carbohydrate, you're doing good. That is the best way to feed on the line, rather than wait until lunch and then take it out, take your giant sandwich out, try to eat the whole thing, and then eat some other stuff. You have to eat small amounts regularly throughout the day. That's what those papers have suggested. So one really cool idea would be to cut the sandwich in half, maybe put a hard card behind it with messages behind each sandwich section that said stuff like this: normal to hard operations, 1 for 1. That means 1 food item an hour. 1/4 of your sandwich, bag of pretzels, juice box, whatever. If it's staging to moderate ops, do 1 for 1.5 hours. So 1 food item every 1.5 hours, because you're not working as hard. You take another sandwich and you get another cool message. Hard operations, 1 liter for 1 hour. Your fluid intake should be about 1 liter in that 1 hour of hard operations. If it's staging to normal ops, you can cut it back. Your fluid should never be, it's not likely that your fluid demands are going to be consistent throughout the day. They're going to be variable. Recovery, we've collected muscle samples and shown that muscle fuel levels are really bad the next day if all you're eating is MREs. And so some messages related to recovery that you might capture if you pull that next sandwich segment out. What sort of things do I need to do? How do I need to do these sort of things, given the constraints that are fire camps and potentially spike camps? How do I get those how do I support those nutritional demands? And then maybe another message on heat and injury risk. Observe adequate work to rest, the message being very important that hydration will not compensate for fitness. So the last thing I'll show you is just this. This is an interactive platform that we're building. We're pilot testing this right now with several hundred crews or several hundred firefighters. This is basically a research resource place where you can go interact with different papers in a way that makes the data digestible. So it takes the research and makes sense out of it for you. It allows you to log in, enroll. It'll build a 12-week or so training program. That's the pilot project we're doing now. It has all the nutritional resources and everything else that'll be accessible. Right now we're just piloting this. We're going to unveil it to the masses after we complete this pilot section. So it may not come to any of you guys until after this season. But it has everything from screening tools to training strategies to appropriate intensities to you name it. It's very comprehensive, and it's highly mobile with video introductions and videos of different exercises, strategies to maybe make the PAC test great again with some assessments and so on. So this has been a long time coming, but I think this is going to be a neat direction down the line. So I guess in conclusion, your job is always going to be difficult. The energy demands are always going to be there. The environmental stress is always going to be there. Understanding how you're limited and what you can and can't do in those settings is very important. Changes in hydration status don't happen much over multiple days of training or operations. Ad lib intake is generally adequate as long as you couple that with adequate on-the-job experience. You can't hydrate yourself to safety if your heat production is off the charts. That's very important. If you don't remember anything else today, remember that. Because you can get yourself into trouble and actually drink too much. That's far more dangerous than not getting enough. Managing the work-to-rest ratios is super important. Feeding strategies matter big time. I'm working with MTVC right now to try to be on the team to target or tackle revising the catering contract. That might mean inclusion of certain supplemental foods that might be reimbursable, so that crews can purchase ahead of the season and then bill those supplies to the incident. That policy is in place, by the way, that allows you to bill certain approved supplemental foods to the incident that you might purchase ahead of time. Pre-season aerobic fitness is absolutely critical. It provides a level of readiness that helps combat heat stress and reduces injury and increases safety overall. And then our next levels of strategy, we hope to improve seasonal readiness, involve this program that we're calling the BLACK, which is a comprehensive training and education platform that we're trying to put together. Whew. Okay, that's 20 years plus worth of stuff, and I didn't even come close to showing all of it. But if you have questions, if you have any interest in any of those papers, that's my email address. If you like WPEM on Facebook, that is a great platform that allows us to put videos and links to different studies or interviews or whatever that we're doing, not just within the world of fire, but all these other projects that we're involved with and have been involved with. So, whew.
Nice job. Thank you so much. Oh. All right, yeah, that brings us up to 1 o'clock. Dr. Ruby is able to stay for a little bit if you have questions. I know we had a couple that came into the chat box, so I'll start right into those. And if you have to jump off, thank you so much for joining us. But if you're able to stay on, please stick around and ask some questions. That's what Brett was looking the most forward to, I think.
Yeah, I can stay around for as much as you really need. Probably a half an hour if you need to.
Thank you.
Or if you want to.
All right, so get started typing those questions into the chat box. The first was actually more of a comment. Tim Kirkpatrick says the Canadian test comes very close to the structural firefighter fitness test in the U.S. Do you have any comments on that, Brett?
I'm trying to find that on the...
All right, so it's a little ways back. So the Canadian fitness test, I believe, the Canadian PAC test fitness test comes close to the structural firefighter fitness test in the U.S. Are you familiar at all with the structural firefighter test in the U.S. or the Canadian test?
No, I'm not super familiar with those. I'm not as familiar with those. We haven't done any work with structural teams in the U.S., but structural tasks are considerably different, and the time requirement and what's available, because they're limited by needing to carry a tank, and that only lasts for so long. And so there's a tendency to work at very high intensities for relatively short periods of time. And that's one of the main differences between the structural world and the wildland world, is that you guys are out there for 16 hours. You don't have to carry a tank that might run out in 20 minutes, depending on how big you are, what your lung capacity is, and what your breathing frequency looks like. And because of the nature of structural suppression, the tasks are considerably different. Lifting, carrying, moving, smashing, all those things exaggerate the metabolic cost. I'm not saying that those don't happen on the wildland fire scene. They don't happen as much. And when they do, or if they do, it's been very hard for us to find opportunities to measure those higher intensity scenarios. The closest we've come is the GPS data. So the Canadian teams, when they built their assessment package, they did a job task analysis. They interviewed individuals. They took tallies of what they thought the most important things were, and then they hand-selected the hardest of the hard and built those into the assessment package. So it doesn't represent the minimal activity or intensity to do the job effectively. It represents the theoretical, because they didn't measure any of this on an actual fire line, it tries to assess the theoretical highest intensity that might be expected, which is very different than what is happening on the actual fire line.
Got it. Thank you. And Tim added just a couple quick comments. He said structural is inherently anaerobic and heat stress is higher, and also the tanks are 30 and 45-minute rated and can be used in tents. So that seems to corroborate what you were saying.
Amen. Yeah. And oh, by the way, the Missoula firefighters took like first, second, and third place at the Seattle. There's a big stair climb in the Columbia Tower, and the Missoula guys took first, second, and third, full gear, full turnout gear, which is pretty impressive. So.
Wow. Tim, rub it in. Okay. So we had another question come in. John Blackstone asked, any real data on the effects of smoke or dust in relation to work capacity? We know what it affects, but have we studied it and considered strategies to mitigate the effects of smoke or dust?
That is, so this is not smoking, but wildland or wood smoke or dust from other particulate in the air, I'm guessing.
Yes.
And yeah, Brian Sharkey did some stuff years ago looking at short-term lung capacity and changes in perhaps seasonal lung capacities using some common measurements that allow you to look at peak flow and peak flow in 1 second and all this stuff. And he didn't see a lot of differences. Now, the university here has an environmental stress facility that allows them to push wood smoke into an enclosed environment. And there's a group within our department that's playing around with that and putting individuals in there and walking them on a treadmill when they're actually inhaling common wood smoke that firefighters would tend to inhale periodically. And they're looking at blood markers, how that might affect certain blood markers. So it is being investigated. The difficulty is it's not likely to negatively affect work capacity in the short term. What will certainly reduce work capacity is to put a bunch of clunky gear on, like a respirator that will impair breathing rate and flow rate and add resistance. That will impair work capacity. The thing is, oftentimes the work capacity is not that excessive. And so periodic use of some of those devices during certain periods of time might be appropriate, but the data is not presently there to support it one way or another yet. So that's a good question.
Yeah, we have a couple more good questions that have come in as well, so I'll keep them coming. Adele asks,
okay.
has the influence of muscle mass been measured in any of the reference tests or on the susceptibility to heat stress and exhaustion?
That's a great question. You would think that, some big dude with a lot of muscle mass is going to be prone to producing monstrous amounts of heat. And yeah, that's the case. And when you see the big football players that go down with heat injury, it's not the big, lean football players. It's the guys that have extra insulation that eliminates the possibility of that heat to get out of the body. And so excessive body fat is going to be much more detrimental than extra muscle mass in terms of helping you alleviate or offload the heat production. The other thing that adds tremendous benefit also is the aerobic fitness of the individual, because crews operate as essentially single units. So the weakest link on the ingress hike to the line is going to be the person with the lowest aerobic capacity. If everybody wants to hike in at 4 miles an hour up this steep grade, well, the person that has the lower aerobic capacity is going to have problems with that. And they're going to lag behind. Their heart rate's going to be exceedingly high. Their skin temperature is going to get high. And as a result of that, they're at a much higher risk for heat-related injury. Okay? The other thing about muscle mass, we have measured changes in muscle mass over the season in some pilot studies, but those, we never published those because the methodologies were not that great, and the data was not really that compelling at that time. But we're revisiting that because this world of wildland fire is sort of the perfect storm at potentially compromising the health of the skeletal muscle. And the reason for that is because of the very high energy expenditure and an inability to answer that energy expenditure with appropriate dietary intake. And we could argue and talk all day long about what the optimal diet is for firefighters. Basically, the optimal diet for firefighters is whatever they'll eat and whatever they'll take in that helps them maintain energy balance. But because there are times when they're in negative energy balance, which means they're expending more than they're taking in, along with the nature of the long hours and the high energy expenditure, that's really not a conducive environment to maintaining skeletal muscle mass. So we are going to, this year, I'm partnering with a colleague at the University of Alaska Fairbanks that has some super cool equipment that I think we're going to work with 2 crews, so about 40 people, what we're going to do is we're going to scan them before the season and at the end of the season, and we're using whole body MRI systems, which are ridiculously expensive to tap into down here in the lower 48. We're just not going to be able to do that. It's too expensive, thousands of dollars per person. So, but he has that equipment. So we're going to scan hopefully 40 people in an MRI. We're also going to use a DEXA system that'll do body composition and skeletal bone health. And so we can look at compartments like the upper arm, the lower arm, the leg, the trunk. Where is the body fat being taken from? If they're losing body fat, where is the muscle mass being added to? Where is it being taken from? And so on. Ultimately, the goal is we want to try to build maybe some new food products that are A, reimbursable with the supplemental food policy, and B, provide an option for better nutrition in spike camp scenarios when otherwise you might just have freaking MREs. And we've shown over and over that MREs just cannot cut it in terms of readying the muscle for the next day. That might be a little off topic, but you said it first. You said muscle mass, so I had to go there a little bit.
Yeah.
And it's kind of it's an exciting next step, being able to have access to some of those tools, which will be really cool this summer. So.
Yeah, sounds exciting. So we have another question that came in, actually a series. So how does the change in altitude affect the oxygen and fluid use? East Coast firefighters fighting in the mountainous West. And another person asked also about humidity. So altitude and humidity affecting oxygen and fluid use.
Yes. So, yeah, if you're coming from a low altitude and you're all of a sudden thrown into a fire in Colorado or Idaho or Montana where it's 9,000 feet or so, yeah, that's going to be you're going to have a wake-up call. It's not going to change. It's not going to. The only way it would change the intensity of the job is that it might change, or hopefully it would change your own wise choices and change your self-selected work intensity. So as soon as you recognize that, hey, wait a minute, this environment is not something I'm used to, what I need to do is downgrade my hike in, and we need to I'm going to cover up these. Sorry, I'm looking at the questions as I'm talking. You need to downgrade your intensity, your self-selected intensity. That will provide protection. And it's not something that, if you just go to a fire in Colorado and you're there for 10 days, it's not like you're going to get all of a sudden really used to the altitude. It doesn't happen that fast. There'll be some subtle changes within the blood that might happen, but it's going to take a long time. And so the only option you have is to make smarter choices with your work-rest ratio and what your actual work intensity might be. The other thing with altitude tends to increase the amount of water loss that happens from respiration. So every time you breathe, expire, you're losing a little bit of fluid, small amounts, but it can add up. And at altitude, one of the normal adjustments is to just take more breaths. That's what a person or an animal does when they go to altitude. That's the immediate response. The small changes in blood pressure and blood chemistry stimulate the respiratory centers of the brain, and you just breathe more frequently. And as you do that, you lose more water through respiration. It's not like you're going to be at 7 liters per day on a fire in Massachusetts in terms of fluid loss and 10 in the mountains of Colorado. That is going to be much more a function of how hard you're working and what the ambient conditions are, more so than altitude. So humidity, how does humidity factor into that? Humidity is the same kind of thing, same kind of problematic way. It is a barrier, just like extra clothes are a barrier to the skin's ability to help you offload heat and evaporate that sweat to cool you. And so humidity provides another barrier to removing heat from the body. And the only way you can combat that is to adjust your work-rest ratio or your workload. And heat and humidity are things that the human can adapt to much better than altitude, because you can start to adjust to the heat within a few days. And it's absolutely incredible what happens in a human that's subjected to heat stress every day, day in, day out. Their sweat rate changes, meaning it goes up. That's a good thing, because when your sweat rate goes up, you have more potential to evaporate that sweat, which is the best way humans can offload heat better than any other animal on the planet. The other thing that happens is the composition of the sweat changes. And so if you notice in the early part of the season, when you've been living your training life in more of an air-conditioned environment, and then the season starts to change and you go out for a jog on the first warm day of the season, and you're sweating and sweat's running into your eyes, and you're like squinting and trying to rub it out because it stings. The reason it stings is because it's highly concentrated with electrolytes, mainly sodium. And so it bugs your eyes and you want to get it out of there. Well, as you become more and more heat acclimatized, the sweat changes its composition and it becomes less and less concentrated with sodium. So you sweat out more, but it's a much waterier sweat. And so as it runs into your eyes, it doesn't bother your eyes at all because it's got such a low concentration of electrolyte, which is it's just a cool adaptation. So it's another way that humans can adapt to these differing environments, and changing your abilities in the heat, that comes a lot quicker than trying to change your ability to combat altitude stress. So,
wow, great, thanks. So another follow-up question, thanks for the muscle mass insights, and then a question, would the pre-test heart rate be measured before the pack test or just the post-test heart rate?
Yeah, you would not need to measure the pre-test heart rate. It's only the heart rate right at the end of the test. The cool thing about carrying a heart rate monitor is if you use a heart rate monitor, that's by far the best, because then you can do the pack test, and you can do the pack test and you can watch your heart rate in real time. It's like, oh, there it is. It's 120. It's 125. And during the pack test, unless you decide to try to catch somebody because you want to beat them, or you want to prove that you're a little bit more badass than they are, and so you increase your pace, best way to approach that test is to start out at the pace that's necessary and stick to that pace. But if you carried a pack at that pace for 1 mile, or if you carried a pack for 3 miles at that same pace, your heart rate's going to be basically the same. And so one easy thing you could do is just get in the habit of periodically carrying a pack at about 4 miles per hour, which is a 15-minute mile, which is what the pack test requires, and watching your heart rate, especially at this time in the early season where it's like, okay, I need to get ready because I'm going to be carrying the pack all damn summer. So if you carry it periodically and just watch your heart rate, the overall calculation is far less important to worry about at this stage because we haven't dialed those equations in just right yet. We're getting very close, I think. And it could be, maybe that's sort of the future app that we could develop, which would be really cool, and especially if it was automatically synced to your chest strap heart rate monitor. You didn't have to do anything, just press go and stop, and it does the calculations for you. But what you'll notice is now you might start the season, you might start right now carrying a pack going, ooh, I forgot what this is like. This is a little bit tricky. And your heart rate is 140 after a mile walking on a treadmill or on a track or whatever, carrying that load. And then as you start to prepare for the season, you start to do a little bit of jogging. You might jump on a rowing machine. You might swim a little bit. You might ride a bike. Hopefully you're carrying a pack and doing some hiking because that's much more specific to what you're going to do. But as you adapt to that training load, if you revisit that pack carry periodically, not every week necessarily, not every 2 weeks, but let's say you've put 4 weeks of preseason training in, and you feel like, you know what, I'm starting to get more adjusted to this. At least I'm liking it a little bit better, whatever. And then you do that pack test again just for 1 mile, and you notice, whoa, I was same pack, same speed on the treadmill or on the track, and yet my heart rate is 130. How in the world did that happen? That is a surefire way to demonstrate to yourself, hey, whatever I'm doing is working, because that's a classic adaptation to aerobic training, is a reduction in the submaximal heart rate at the same absolute work rate. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Hopefully that makes sense. So you can just watch your heart rate during training, especially if you're doing the exact same task. As you adapt, doing the exact same task is going to show a lower heart rate. And that's a surefire way to demonstrate that you're creating adaptations. The other way to do that is considerably less comfortable, and that is, oh, you want to see if you're getting better? Okay, how fast can you run 1.5 miles? Okay, that's really hard. That made me throw up. Okay, but I ran this fast, whatever. And then I train, and then I decide, okay, I really need to see how much better I'm getting. I guess I'll run 1.5 miles again as hard as I can. And you do that, and you're like, wow, I was 15 seconds faster. I still feel like crap, but I was 15 seconds faster. It's always more fun to feel the fatigue of exercise at a faster speed. But you'd have to do that performance trial over and over to recognize the aerobic benefits. Whereas this pack test heart rate response is very simple, and it's just submaximal. So it shouldn't be intimidating at all.
Got it. We have one more question. This might be our last unless anybody has any final thoughts in the chat box. So the question from Tim is, besides losing more water, what does the overventilation effect have on work capacity, blowing off CO2?
Yeah, that's a good question. What does the overventilation effect have on blowing? You do tend to blow off a little bit more CO2, but what you're trying to do, I'm assuming this is related to altitude. So when you go to altitude, the blood O2 level changes ever so slightly, but it's enough to change. It's enough of a change that it stimulates those respiratory centers in the brain. And so you may go from a basal 13 breaths per minute to like 20 breaths per minute. And what that does is you do end up blowing off basically the same net amount of CO2, but it allows you to pull more O2 into the blood. That's really the main goal of that ventilation. The blowing off of CO2 is absolutely necessary, but the only reason why you'd be blowing off extra CO2 is if you were producing it through metabolic activity, because that's where all the CO2 comes from, is from the metabolic activity. You produce you take in very little CO2 if the gas is right, which it always is most of the time on the planet. It's very, very low, well below 1% CO2 that you inhale. You expire about 5% of your gas is CO2. And the only reason for that big discrepancy is because the CO2 that you produce in the body is from high amounts of metabolic activity. So.
Got it. Thanks. Let's give folks just another minute to type any questions into the chat box. But if not, Dr. Ruby, you might want to put together any concluding thoughts. And we really appreciate your sticking around to answer questions for so long after the webinar.
Oh, yeah, no problem. If anybody wanted to email me, the one thing that I'm intrigued by getting some feedback on is when we go, so what we're going to do is we're going to build some prototype nutritional products. They're basically going to be like soups or AM flavored kind of coffee foods. So it's a powdered mix that we're building. And we're gonna build I have funding to build a bunch of these prototypes. It doesn't come from any Forest Service money. It's just some of my own research money. So I'm going to build a bunch of prototypes, but I'm curious to know what sort of flavors would be most appealing if you're in a spike camp scenario and it's relatively easy with a jet boil perhaps to boil some water, dump the powder in an Nalgene bottle, shake it up, and you've got 300 calories. And the calories are coming from non-GMO food items, a variety of whole proteins that we would add to it, and then some certain flavors. I see Tim put spicy down. Yeah, we have like chicken, we have like tomato ideas, we have some sort of Southwest spicy type flavor, and then flavors in the morning. Yeah, exactly. Cocoa and coffee. If your coffee or your cocoa or your mocha, whatever you want to call it, can you imagine if that had 20 grams of protein in it and 50 grams of carbohydrate? You wouldn't necessarily want that in your day-to-day job, but if you're getting ready to go out for 16 hours and all you've had is MREs, and you have the opportunity to say, you know what, I'm kind of getting addicted to my skeletal muscle mass. I don't want to lose all this. If you take the right amounts of protein that is in the right combination of essential amino acids, you can help preserve that. And so it could be like spiked coffee with a purpose, because you're not going to get you're going to get the stimulant from regular coffee, which is nice in the morning. But if you could get some extra calories to help add to what the MREs are certainly not providing you, at least if you're not going to stay in energy balance, if you're going to be in negative energy balance and likely to lose a little weight, at least you can preserve your muscle mass. So those are some of the main reasons for trying this pilot study. And so I hope by the beginning of the season to have 1,000 or so of these units. And I'd love to send them out to different crews just to get feedback. And we'll probably have some SurveyMonkey online survey that we'd have people take. If we ship them to you, it's like, hey, try these out. What did you like? When did you use them? What would you like better? Blah, 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 whatever. That's sort of our plan. It's like enough is enough with the research papers. That's great and everything, but we want to try to take some of that data and build some tools that we can get out onto the line effectively. So.
Wow, sounds good. I suspect you'll be getting several emails about favorite flavors and places to send some of the samples. So I see we're getting very close to the extra half hour limit. So I think I'll cut off the webinar at this point and just say thank you again so much for presenting your research and sharing your knowledge and wisdom and witticisms. I think this is an extremely valuable webinar, and we really appreciate your taking the time to join us.
Oh, thank you so much. That was a real pleasure for me. So great.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us, and take care. Be safe out there.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.